It seems like every few years, this Audit the Fed thing pops up again.
Oh, yeah.
Like almost like a political groundhog, see how
Right.
long winter's going to be.
Yeah, yeah.
But this time we're going to go a little deeper.
Okay.
We're doing a deep dive into this article called Audit the Fed, is a central bank antithetical to democracy. And it's got some pretty interesting arguments about how much power and influence the Federal Reserve really has.
Yeah, this article, it really digs into this whole idea of auditing the Fed as like a way to control the deep state,
Okay.
and how people like Ron Paul and Rand Paul and Thomas Massie, they've really championed this movement.
Right.
And they're saying it's not just some like fringe idea,
Right.
but like a crucial step to make things more transparent.
Yeah, because it's easy to dismiss it as just like a, conspiracy theory or something.
Yeah.
But the article pushes back and says, no, look, they already have these limited audits.
Right.
But it's like you're taking your car to a mechanic and they let you look under the hood, but they're keeping the engine block totally covered.
Exactly. Yeah.
They might check the oil, make sure the numbers add up, but the real nitty-gritty, like, why did they do qualitative easing? Who benefited from all those bailouts?
Right.
That stuff remains hidden.
Exactly. And that lack of transparency, that's really a big part of their argument. They're saying that the Fed, it's technically created by Congress, but it operates in this kind of like gray area, intertwined with the government and Wall Street.
Right.
And they even use this phrase revolving door to describe how officials are constantly moving between like all three of these entities.
Yeah, it's a good point, because if the same people are cycling through the Fed, Congress, and Wall Street,
Right.
how can the Fed really be making decisions that are objective?
Exactly. Yeah. And that's a really concerning implication, right?
Yeah, and the article goes even further, saying that the Fed's power, it's not just limited to monetary policy anymore.
Right.
They're getting involved in things like climate change regulations, even talking about equitable distribution of employment.
Wow.
I mean, imagine an unelected body getting to decide who gets jobs.
Yeah.
That's a lot of influence.
Yeah, and they point to the creation of this Financial Stability Climate Committee
Right.
and a Supervision Climate Committee as like proof that this is happening.
Okay.
It really suggests that the Fed is blurring the lines between monetary policy and, these broader social and political goals.
Okay, so they're setting interest rates, they're dabbling in climate change, and maybe even influencing who gets jobs.
Right.
But how does this impact, me and you and everyone listening every day?
Right.
Well, the article argues that one of the biggest consequences is inflation.
Yeah.
Think about going to the grocery store, and suddenly everything costs twice as much.
Right. And they link that directly to policies like quantitative easing.
Yeah.
Which sounds really complicated, but just think about it like this. The Fed pumps trillions of dollars into the economy,
Right.
hoping to stimulate growth.
Right.
But the authors argue that this is kind of like flooding your engine with gas.
Okay.
It might rev things up temporarily,
Right.
but it can also lead to overheating,
Yeah.
which in this case means inflation.
And we all feel that when we can't buy as much stuff as we used to.
Exactly. Our purchasing power goes down.
Yeah.
Our savings don't go as far.
Right, and they use the 2008 financial crisis as like a prime example.
Right.
Remember that
Yeah.
the Fed's balance sheet just explodes to like $4.5 trillion?
It's massive.
Huge. And the question the article raises, where did all that money go and who really benefited?
Yeah, a full audit could maybe answer that question.
Right.
Was it really necessary to save the economy?
Right.
Or did it just make the gap between Wall Street and Main Street even bigger?
Yeah, and the article throws out this crazy statistic from Forbes. After the Fed put $3.3 trillion into the economy in 2020, 650 billionaires in America saw their net worth go up by over $1 trillion.
Wow.
So while a lot of people were struggling, a select few were getting massively richer.
That's right.
So it makes you wonder
Yeah.
about who these policies are really helping.
Yeah. Are they really working for us, or are they just serving the interests of like a small group of elites?
And this ties into the article's claim that the Fed is part of the deep state.
Right.
This network of, unelected bureaucrats with tons of power who might be getting manipulated by special interests.
It's a pretty provocative idea.
Yeah, it does make you think.
It does. It really does.
So if we can't ensure that our interests are being represented, then what?
Right.
Well, the article says there's a pretty radical solution.
Okay.
The nuclear option, as they call it.
Yeah.
Abolishing the Federal Reserve entirely.
That's right.
Wow.
They're arguing for a return to a truly free market.
Okay.
Where interest rates are set by, supply and demand.
Right.
Not by some central authority.
Okay, hold on. A truly free market for credit.
Yeah.
Wouldn't that mean interest rates could go sky high?
That's the concern, yeah.
Making it impossible for people to get loans for homes or businesses?
Right. Like the article acknowledges that a free market approach would probably be way more volatile.
Okay.
But they also say it would be way more transparent and less susceptible to, manipulation by these special interests.
So it's like stability versus transparency.
Exactly. Yeah.
That's a tough one.
It's a tough call for sure, but the point of the article is really to start a conversation.
Yeah.
To get people thinking critically about what the Fed does
Right.
and whether it's really serving the best interests of the American people.
Yeah, and this deep dive has been really eye-opening so far.
It has.
We've seen some surprising things about the Fed's power and influence. We've explored the arguments for auditing the Fed, the potential consequences of its policies, and even this radical idea of just getting rid of it altogether.
It's a lot to consider.
Yeah, but we're not done yet.
Right.
In the next part of our deep dive, we're going to look at some alternative viewpoints.
Okay.
See what people who support the Fed have to say about its role in stabilizing the economy.
Interesting.
We're also going to dig a little deeper into this whole deep state concept and what it could mean for our financial system.
Okay, I'm ready.
So stay tuned because this deep dive is about to get even more interesting. Okay, so we're back and we're continuing our deep dive into the Federal Reserve.
Yeah.
And, the article that we're talking about, it's pretty critical.
Right.
But it's important to remember there are other points of view out there.
Of course.
Not everyone sees the Fed as this, shadowy, all-powerful entity.
Yeah, a lot of economists would argue that the Fed plays a really vital role in keeping the economy stable, especially, during times of crisis.
Right.
Like, think about the 2008 financial meltdown.
Yeah.
The Fed pumped trillions of dollars into the system.
Right.
And a lot of experts believe that's what prevented a total collapse.
So they're saying that the Fed is actually a force for good.
Yeah, basically.
Stepping in to prevent chaos when things start to go off the rails.
Exactly. Their argument is that the Fed's ability to, control interest rates and put more money into the market, it helps to smooth out the bumps in the road.
Right.
Without the Fed, they say we'd be way more vulnerable to these wild swings.
Right.
More frequent recessions and more severe ones too.
Yeah, okay, I see their point. But wouldn't that level of intervention kind of stifle innovation and create what economists call moral hazard?
Right.
If businesses know they're going to get bailed out, why would they bother acting responsibly?
Yeah, that's definitely a legitimate concern.
Right.
Critics of the Fed would say that it creates this too big to fail mentality where risky behavior is actually encouraged because, if things go bad, the government will probably step in and soften the blow.
So we've got these two very different perspectives on the Fed.
Right.
One side says it's a threat to democracy, maybe even serving special interests. The other side says it's essential for keeping the economy from going haywire.
Right.
It's fascinating that both sides have pretty compelling arguments.
Yeah, they each make some valid points, for sure.
So the article we've been discussing, it really leans towards this free market approach.
Yeah.
Saying we should have a system where interest rates are determined by supply and demand.
Right.
And not by, some central authority.
Yeah, but wouldn't that be a little bit like playing with fire?
Yeah.
I mean, interest rates could just go through the roof.
Right.
And make it impossible for people to get loans. That's definitely the fear. A truly free market for credit would be really volatile.
Yeah.
And some economists would argue that, the level of instability would be too much for a complex, interconnected economy like ours.
So maybe there's a middle ground here.
Possibly.
Maybe the answer isn't to abolish the Fed entirely.
Right.
But to reform it so that it's more transparent and accountable.
That's a possibility. Yeah, the article, it focuses on the more extreme options.
Right.
Either a full audit leading to dismantling the whole thing.
Yeah.
Or keeping things exactly as they are.
Right.
But there's a whole range of potential reforms out there.
Right.
That could, address some of the concerns about transparency and influence.
Right.
Without completely overhauling the entire system.
Okay, let's shift gears for a second and go back to this idea of the deep state.
Okay.
The article implies that the Fed is tangled up in this web of unelected bureaucrats.
Right.
Who are maybe, manipulating policy for their own personal benefit.
Yeah.
Is this a legitimate concern, or is it just like a conspiracy theory?
Well, the existence of a deep state is definitely a controversial topic.
Yeah.
Some people think it's just paranoia,
Right.
while others believe it's a very real and powerful force,
Right.
operating behind the scenes to influence policy.
Okay, but if it does exist, how would it even work?
Right.
What would that look like?
The theory is that within these large bureaucracies, you have these career officials
Right.
who have a ton of knowledge and influence.
Right.
They might not always agree with the elected leaders,
Right.
and they could leverage their positions to kind of subtly shape policy.
Right.
Or even undermine directives that they don't like.
So you're saying there could be people pulling strings behind the curtain,
It's possible.
working against what the people actually want.
Yeah, and that's what the article uses to explain how the Fed might be susceptible to outside influence.
Right.
They're saying that the Fed's structure its independence from, direct political control could make it vulnerable to manipulation by these unelected officials or
Right.
even special interest groups.
But if they're operating in the shadows, how can we ever know for sure?
That's the challenge with this whole concept.
Yeah.
The very nature of a deep state implies secrecy and hidden agendas.
This is starting to feel like an episode of the X-Files.
All right.
Are we really talking about, like, shadowy figures controlling the world's finances?
Well, let's try to bring this back down to earth a little bit.
Okay.
The article, it presents a particular point of view,
Right.
but it's important for us to think critically and, really evaluate the evidence.
Right.
It's good to be skeptical and question the systems that govern our lives, but we also have to be careful not to just accept every conspiracy theory that comes along.
Right. You're right. It's about finding that balance
Yeah.
between healthy skepticism and, looking at the evidence.
Exactly. And remember, even if we can't definitively prove that a deep state exists,
Right.
just being aware of the possibility encourages us to be more vigilant,
Right.
to demand more transparency, and to hold those in power accountable.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah.
It's about staying informed, asking tough questions, and not just blindly accepting things.
Exactly.
Right.
And that applies to the Fed as well,
Right.
Whether you think it needs to be audited, abolished, or reformed,
Right.
the key is to understand its power, its influence,
Yeah.
and how its decisions impact all of our lives.
And this deep dive has really opened my eyes to some of that.
I think so too.
We've explored the arguments for and against the Fed, delved into all the complexities of arguing it.
Yeah.
We even ventured into this kind of murky world of the deep state.
It's been quite a journey.
Yeah.
And we're not quite finished yet in the final part of our deep dive.
Yeah.
We'll wrap things up by looking at some of the potential long-term consequences of the Fed's actions.
Okay.
And think about what a truly reformed or maybe even a totally different financial system might look like.
All right, so stick with us.
Yeah.
This deep dive is about to get even more thought-provoking. Okay, so we're back for the final part of our deep dive into the Federal Reserve.
All right.
It's been a lot to process audits and conspiracies and even abolishing the whole thing.
Yeah.
But before we wrap up, I want to take a step back and look at the big picture.
Okay.
What are the long-term consequences of the Fed having so much power and influence?
That's where things get really interesting. This article argues that a lot of the Fed's policies, especially things like quantitative easing,
Right.
they contribute to these boom and bust cycles that we see in the economy.
You mean like periods of really fast growth followed by these sudden crashes?
Exactly like what happened in 2008.
Right.
Remember how the Fed's balance sheet just blew up to $4.5 trillion during that crisis?
Yeah, it was huge.
Yeah. The article questions whether those actions, even though they seemed necessary at the time,
Right.
might have actually created a much more fragile system in the long run.
So they're saying that by always stepping in to fix things, the Fed could be making things worse.
Yeah, creating this artificial sense of stability
Right.
that could lead to even bigger problems down the line.
And the article suggests that a full audit could show us just how deep these issues go.
Exactly. Imagine all the information that could come out, details about who got bailed out,
Right.
how involved the Fed really is in these non-monetary policy areas,
Right.
and maybe even proof that certain special interest groups have too much influence.
It would be like finally opening up that black box at the heart of our financial system.
Yeah.
Okay, but let's just say for a minute that this whole audit the Fed thing actually gains some traction.
Okay.
And they do a full audit.
Mm-hmm.
What happens then?
Well, it really depends what they find.
Right.
I mean, if the audit uncovers some serious wrongdoing or just gross incompetence,
Yeah.
it could lead to people demanding big changes
Right.
or even a complete overhaul of the whole system.
So it could be the first step towards dismantling the Fed as we know it.
It's possible, yeah. But even if the audit doesn't lead to anything that drastic,
Right.
it could still force the Fed to be more transparent and accountable.
Right.
It could give Congress more control over monetary policy.
Okay, so let's imagine for a second that the Fed has either been reformed or abolished.
Okay.
What would a truly transparent and accountable financial system even look like?
That's a tough question. Some people who support a free market approach,
Right.
they believe that a system where interest rates are just set by supply and demand
Right.
would be inherently more transparent.
But wouldn't that also be super unpredictable?
Oh, for sure. There would be a lot more volatility.
Yeah.
But the argument is that this volatility would be natural.
Okay.
It would reflect real economic conditions,
Right.
not some manipulation by a central authority.
I see how that could be appealing. A system that's driven by the market, not by the whims of some unelected officials.
Exactly.
But is it really realistic?
Hmm.
Could we really function without some kind of central bank to manage things?
That's the big question, right?
Yeah.
There are economists who argue that we could use a decentralized system,
Okay.
maybe using things like blockchain and cryptocurrencies,
Right.
to create a viable alternative to this traditional central banking model.
So instead of having one all-powerful Fed, we could have a system that's more distributed, more democratic in a way.
Yeah, that's the general idea, but it's all very theoretical at this point.
Right.
There would be a lot of really complex challenges
Yeah.
that we'd have to figure out before we could implement something like that on a large scale.
This whole deep dive has really given me a lot to think about.
It's a lot to process.
We've gone from talking about auditing the Fed to imagining completely new financial systems.
Yeah, it's like we've fallen down the rabbit hole and come out in a whole different world.
And that's what I love about exploring these complicated issues. It makes you question your assumptions.
Absolutely.
It forces you to think critically.
Yeah.
And it just helps you understand the forces that are shaping our world.
It broadens your perspective.
As I've been listening to you talk, it struck me that this whole debate about the Fed really boils down to one fundamental question. How much control should we have over our own economic destiny?
That's a good question.
Do we trust a central authority to manage the system, or do we believe in the power of the free market to self-regulate?
That's a question that everyone has to answer for themselves.
Right.
And there's no easy answer, but hopefully this deep dive has given you the information and the tools you need
Right?
to form your own opinion.
Absolutely. We've explored all the different arguments, examined the calls for transparency, and even considered some really alternative financial systems.
It's been a wild ride.
Yeah, and I hope our listeners feel empowered to continue this conversation.
Yeah, to keep asking questions, keep exploring,
Right.
and to really engage in this debate about what role the Federal Reserve should play in our society.
Because at the end of the day, the future of our financial system is in our hands.
That's right.
So on that note, we'll leave you to ponder all the complexities of the Fed and the future of finance.
Happy pondering.
Keep diving deep, keep asking questions, and remember, knowledge is power.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Until next time, thanks for joining us on The Deep Dive.